Hey y'all, my name is Shenan Worrel. I'm an ex-UVA debater, and I'm going to give a brief presentation on social justice debate. I did accidentally record a version of this that was egregiously long and egregiously overcomplicated. If you're interested in the deluxe edition or just want to talk through anything more in depth, feel free to shoot me an email. I've linked it at the end. So I lean social justice debate broadly because, in my opinion, it is a kind of debate that particularly rewards people who really engage with the subject matter rather than like econ, which to some extent, if you've got the mechanics, like you can make almost anything work. I do think that social justice debate does particularly reward like real thought and engagement beforehand, which is not to say that econ doesn't at all, but I do think that SJ does more so. So I group them together because I think that the way that this looks at its best is oftentimes the same. And the TLDR is just like being very good at reading and listening well, like suspending assumptions and the age-old desire to come up with arguments about something instantaneously, but instead just like sitting with the material, sitting with the material and learning about it, and then engaging with it deeply and well, which is a skill that I think everyone can get good at, and it's a really cool skill to hone and use in debate. So, what does this look like? In my opinion, it's not really something you can get from a lecture series. Whatever in-depth media looks like for you. Like for me, it was always journal articles, books, essays, etc. I would enjoy the occasional like YouTube lecture series for people that are more like podcast people, but anything that really makes you have to kind of like work through information and sit with it um is really useful. You're especially going to want to prioritize the like subject matter that you're less familiar with. And if you're really scared about where to start, a quick search on YouTube, looking through syllabi, asking like friends what they've read, talking to them about things are all really good places to start. It's really important to learn what you need to do to really like be able to sit with something and understand it in all of its contours. For me, that was annotating. I annotate like literally every single thing that is within 6 feet of me. Um, but definitely it's different for everyone. After you feel like you've really engaged with it, the thing that really helped me kind of get that argument generation, really good argument generation and debate was like come up with one argument. It doesn't necessarily have to be an argument, but it could be like a limitation, or it could be like if you're comparing two articles that are about the same thing, discussing how they interact with each other and really exploring that. Or it could just be a counter argument. Like that was my thing most of the time. And when you're doing that, instead of like doing the debate thing where you try and kind of get the biggest reasonable possible impact, instead try and prioritize the one that is most true to the text and true in real life. Like try and hold yourself to a standard of evidence and like intuition and really just try to make the best argument possible. Obviously, it doesn't actually need to be in essay format. I more mean you really want to prioritize depth and quality over like, you know, how big is your claim versus my claim? My claim's very big. Um, Instead, just like try and get good at thinking through things on a lot of different levels and understanding them in a way that is a lot more cognizant of its limitations. And then once you've thought about like an argument that you really, really like, even if it's like a paper like from a paper from a class, you can think about how it would apply to debate. And what I mean by this is like literally what kind of argument do you think it would be best as? Like, would it be Wang? Would it be super good framing? Would it be, and if it is framing, what level of the debate is that happening at? Is it more likely to frame, is it like framing how change happens? Is it framing who a certain actor is, etc.? Um, and then what cases it's most likely to come up. And that I always find to be a really fun thought exercise. And actually, if you try hard enough, you can use it in a debate round. So it's always fun to like actually get to do those and just to like get a better pipeline going of how you can kind of get your thoughts to fit into the structure of debate and how can you can get the best understanding of your thoughts possible and just look honestly how to make them better. Um, brief history lesson. So one quick note on social movement theory broadly. Something that it really has to grapple with is the fact that it tries to make very broad generalizations about like a really fluid and a really increasingly both centralized and decentralized movement. For example, despite the fact that, like, I mean, most feminine, like, if we have three different protests on different cities in the East Coast for that all call themselves feminists, and they're organized around different principles, they have broadly different tactics, and they're very different groups of people that aren't really in contact with each other at all, they would all be considered part of the feminist movement. But institutionally and like colloquially, they're all probably different movements. And so social movement theory sometimes tries to say that like something is true in every instance without adequately addressing how complex things are. That is, I think, always useful to keep in the back of your mind whenever you're thinking about social movement theory, and also just from a debate context, that can be a little consideration that you can use to your advantage if you get pretty creative with it. So the waves of feminism. Um, the first wave of feminism is essentially in the 1800s, beginning in the United States. We have the movement of women in the movement of women to essentially get the right to vote. It then spreads to Britain and then elsewhere, and it's impossible to talk about the first wave of feminism without talking about the like betrayal of the abolitionist movement and Black women, and their advocacy whatsoever, especially because some of the earliest proponents of women's suffrage used to be involved in the abolitionist movement, but then the suffrage movement essentially cut all ties with them, was deeply publicly racist, and then was deeply segregationist. It's impossible to talk about the history of women's suffrage without including that. The second wave of feminism, all the waves of feminism emerge in response to each other. It's a little bit kind of like art movements in that way, where like something that one didn't consider then becomes like the basis for the next. They really are pretty closely related. So the second wave of feminism, obviously, it's quite difficult to like label something as the starting point, but was deeply influenced by a series of books, literature, and essays. And then you have a broader and more frequent public understanding, I guess, of the really visceral reality of patriarchy. Um, One really key defining feature is that it addresses the experience of women in a way that's a whole lot broader than just the right to vote. Fun fact that I found very interesting is that it was actually really deeply facilitated by businesses owned by feminists specifically, which I thought was kind of interesting. The third wave of feminism emerges in the 1990s, and it's really influenced by a cultural movement, sociocultural movement known as postmodernism, which is in itself a little bit hard to define, but is really, what's really characteristic of it is this idea of like deconstruction and like taking something that we take for granted and really holding it up to the like microscope of, okay, but what does this mean and what really is it? Um, and so this really asks the question of, okay, but what does it mean to be a feminist? And this is when we get the idea of intersectionality, which is essentially just that ex identity and oppression aren't just a summation of their component parts. For example, um, Black women and their experiences and oppression aren't just defined by one of those two component parts, but instead a unique and particular interplay of a unique and particular interplay. The movement itself was facilitated a lot by the emergence of technology and social media, this really global network now of communication allowed for that communication to be more efficient and allowed for a lot of the like deconstructive work that feminism did. For example, there is no one way to be a woman. There's no one way for a woman to dress. A lot of that work was done in this third wave of feminism. The fourth wave of feminism um, is guesstimated to have begun like 2010-ish. And what it's characterized by is the same usage of technology and building off of the ideas that we get from the third wave that really, really focus and center around intersectionality and diversity and inclusion and all of the things that feminism had begun considering a lot more. And combining that with a real focus on the material reality of patriarchy that we get to some extent from the second wave of feminism. A really good and pretty commonly used example of this is the fourth wave of feminism. Mandatory disclaimer, I'm not by academic training like feminist theory and feminist history are not my academic area of expertise. If anyone has things they would like to add or mistakes I made, please feel free to shoot me an email. So, when we're thinking about debate broadly, both in subject matter and structurally, it's very easy to go top down. What is the highest layer of the debate theoretically, and then move down from there, or like what's the weighing and then go all the way down, like what's the controlling layer and then move. So a very small minority of your cases of your rounds about feminism are going to be about feminist theory, which is essentially just what does it mean to be a woman, what does it mean to and what should feminism do? What is feminism? All of these questions that like, what is something and what should it do, in turn control what exactly the thing is. For example, a feminism that should do A is a little bit different than a feminism that should do B. Um, and so these are all controlling or higher level questions, and sometimes a layer of the debate that you're going to want to be able to talk about. The most common one is feminist politics. I've put some common examples below. And then the third is this is never going to be its own debate, but will sometimes be a part of a separate debate about like what the feminist movement is. So in a roundabout feminist theory, here are just some like concepts that are going to be like pretty necessary for you to engage. The first is the idea of normativity. Normativity in this context means what society tells you that you should do, oftentimes based on a certain thing. Performativity in feminist theory was originated from Judith Butler, and it tries to answer this question of like, okay, but what does it mean to be a woman? Like, how can I see myself as something when like womanhood isn't really a thing that I can like what is womanhood then and why is it something that I feel that I am? And the way that they answer this question is there are all of these normative discourses that tell us what women are and what women should do. For example, you're a girl, so you should wear this or sit this way, or examples of normative discourses. And because there's power behind them, like social power behind them, oftentimes we follow through with them. And then according to performativity, we understand this consistent set of like actions or response to normative discourses as being a result of something inherent in us. And so, really, womanhood is this performance of the normative discourse rather than is this performance of the normative discourse, or more accurately, in response to it, if that makes sense. The other one that is useful to know is Marx's idea of historical materialism. It's a way of looking at history, and I won't be able to do its due diligence, but essentially what it says is that the social construct emerges as a result of material disparities in order to perpetuate them. For example, because there are material disparities between men and women, we get this concept of, or like just certain material conditions, I guess. We get this concept of womanhood in order to gain something material. For example, unpaid domestic labor is really frequently evoked. And a historical materialist view would look at like women in labor and say that like, okay, womanhood exists as a way to like get labor, to perpetuate certain material disparities or maintain them. Um, and as such, it's resultant from like a real material condition instead of this idea of like a normative discourse. Instead of like just being located in the like sociocultural realm, if that makes sense. Um, there's a separate line of debate, not debate like debate in an academic sense. I don't think you'll ever see this as a debate round, is to like neither of these explain the like if the chicken or the egg, like who was the first one. Um, but you will never, almost certainly not have to worry about that in a debate round. So I'm not gonna go over this too in depth, but this is like if we are to apply a top-down approach to feminist politics, here are some things that you should always make sure that you're considering and some examples. Again, normally just a top-down approach and then how what works best for you is always very useful. The other two things you're always going to want to be careful about are one, what the differences between the worlds, and two, the context of the round, which I guess would just be the yeah, are just always important to also make sure you're considering. So that was a lot. I'm also not going to go through all of this. On the right and on the next slide, I just kind of put some of my brainstorming notes when I was thinking about the motion. Those, I think, mostly I put just to show that like you will develop your own system as you're brainstorming, try to link things together to like tell stories, make things in a way that makes sense to you, keep track of like what something is. Is it a link? Is it an impact? Could it be a bunch of different things? Um, yeah, those that I think those are the big ones. Um, so this is a motion I just got from like debate data, and it came up like literally 10 times. And so despite the fact that I don't find it super interesting, it's probably important to like have an idea of how to debate it. I think that the harder or the less intuitive side is the op. So we're going to pretend that we are huge choice feminists today. Um, and so the first thing we're always going to want to do is pick out what's important in the motion. Choice feminism is left pretty broad as to what it is. And by that, I mean, dude, the door's like wide open. Second, it's in the context of the present, like the harm it is doing now, not that it has done historically, which I think is probably good for Ob because we get to defend a more refined version. And then the third is that the feminist movement door has also been left wide, wide, wide open. So ideally, when you're brainstorming, you can, in the back of your head, just be going through all of the layers. Um, So if we were to just write like a first argument for op or think of a broad strokes approach to how to debate it, I always think that the most useful thing to do is to have an idea of what the best stock gov is going to be. In this case, I think that you're going to get a lot of govs that say that choice feminism is this idea that everything women do is praxis. And as such, that's going to lead to like nothing ever getting done. People are going to be super dissatisfied with the movement, so on and so forth, etc. Um, and so if we're to simplify that, really they're just going to say it's going to be like implemented really, really poorly. Um, and that's always going to be something you want to consider when you're writing the structure of your arguments. You want to write your arguments to beat the good guff. Um, not just to be arguments in the void that you figure out how to win later. So if we're to keep that in mind, I think that the first thing that we can do is just define what the most favorable concept of choice feminism is for us. In my opinion, the most favorable concept of choice feminism is just that, like, every action a woman does, being feminist, doesn't necessarily mean that every action a woman does is feminist praxis. So, if the goal of feminism is to improve one of the goals of feminism is to improve the freedom of women under patriarchy, and many of the actions that we take are, especially those that are criticized as being are or aren't feminist, are the ones that do exist in that like whether or not wearing makeup is anti-feminist. The door was open for us to have that option to some extent because the door was widened for gender expression because of feminism. Um, and so this is freedom that was won for us to some extent by the movement and the deconstruction that it did. That's an aside. The TLDR is that just because something is feminist does not also mean that it's praxis. It just means that like feminism seeks to further the freedom of women, and this is an action done as an expression of that freedom. The second thing we're going to want to define is the feminist movement. I don't really necessarily think that's actually going to be doesn't need to be important in this case, so we can put that to the side. The part that I think is more important is that it does. This is interesting because I think that we can use that on the implementation level to talk about why we think that this is a little bit of a more refined version. The other thing in the building blocks that I think is always important to go through is like, okay, what's the delta in the round and what's the context? So because the context isn't given, it's context that we would need to do a little bit of like justification for. And when you're doing justification for context, you're always going to want to have an example, like the judge is going to want to be convinced because a lot of your story is going to be contingent on it. And the second is going to be the delta in the round. I think that the best way to approach this is all of us have probably heard criticisms of the feminist movement that's like, it's over the top, it's hysterical, it's too there's a super high level of scrutiny, or we can think about times that we've seen individual women's actions be held up to a really strict microscope of whether, like, especially think like celebrities or pop stars, of whether or not they're good for feminism very, very publicly on social media. And so I think that we can define that as the context, right? Like, and then the delta is okay, Gov world is going to be a world in which um there's just essentially, this kind of like there's a tendency towards individual scrutiny in the feminist movement, and scrutinizing individual women's actions is a very frequent tendency and a very frequent domain of the feminist movement. And op world is in a world in which we also have choice feminism, which we're going to say is just this understanding that like essentially everything a woman does to some extent is feminist. Importantly, in the op world, these things exist together. Um, one of them doesn't just go away. And so I think that leads to a really interesting and necessary question is to like, okay, but how do they interact and how are they likely to interact? Um, and so that's all the implementation structural stuff that I think is like immediately important on first glance. And then if we were to go through a little bit more in depth, you have a bunch of other questions as to like, does this affect other movements? How the base is going to interact, how the public is going to interact, and how people who are actively like disenfranchised or hostile towards feminism are going to receive this. One quick note is that, especially in movement politics rounds, or in any round that you are going to get a bunch of different responses to something, it's very useful to separate that out into groups. And that's because every single group is essentially in itself a link, and it allows the argument to have a lot more contour and to be a lot more understandable than just saying people are going to like this. Okay, so we have a lot of thoughts about the motion, and we have a lot of thoughts about what we need to do as the op, but how do we make that into like an op that's winning and understandable? So the first thing that I always like to do is just grouping. So if I have my brain dump of like, okay, everything that might be important, here are like some potential links, some potential considerations. I separate those out into like groups or stories. And it's kind of useful just because you want to make sure that things follow from each other. And then I always hold it up to the standard of like, okay, but which do I think is like compelling, true, and also winning in the context of the other side? So if we were to try to do it for this one, um, the bottom right is essentially just like my total brain dump. Um, and on the left is a far more complicated version of, I think, the framing that isn't really necessary. So with everything that we have, I think that a really good op can just start with the observation that before choice feminism and during choice feminism, there's a tendency in the feminist movement towards making the personal the the political, like the end all be all. I think that there's some good analysis. You never really want to overclaim as much as you can avoid it. And so there's a really good asterisk under that that's like, even if that's not true, the discourse that people are going to see more often because it's more easily sensationalized is going to be discourse that like tries to make the personal the political instead of the political, because the political is not as like, fun and interesting. It's actually, I mean, it's a lot more visceral and upsetting and requires a lot more imagination and work from us. So observation at the top. The framing after that, I think, probably needs to just contextualize where we are in the context of the motion. And so I think the way that that is more likely to go at its best is probably just that, like, this is going to be done. This is really likely to be done well. Specifically, it's way more likely to be done in a way that's like every action is an expression of freedom rather than every action is an expression of praxis. And if we were to make links for this, it's way easier if we separate it out into group. So if we consider the feminist base, they're not really likely to believe that like every single thing someone does is praxis because that would make the movement completely ineffective. It would kill their ability to get new people. And like it would completely kill their ability to it really just dilutes the meaning of the word that they've really sacrificed a lot for. Like if someone giving up makeup for 2 days was presumably both feminist and feminist praxis and something that like we should be doing, that probably isn't super compelling to someone that has been like, you know, working in a women's shelter for the past 2 decades. um, the second group of people are probably people that are like again disenfranchised towards or hostile towards feminism. They probably also will react poorly to that sentiment just because they don't want to be involved with feminism and feminist praxis. Instead, they're a lot more likely to purport an understanding of choice feminism that is just simply like feminism doesn't get to tell me like essentially what I do in my home and what decisions that I make in my personal life. And so, and because these understandings are like probably like come from a place of anger, they're also uniquely likely to be sensationalized and get a little bit more weight in shaping the public understanding. Thirdly, it's just not like praxis is defined in part by action. It's not intuitive to people why an action that they would take anyways is of any particular importance towards a social movement. Like that's just not broadly compelling. And even if it was really compelling and really cool, it's not a really interesting or profound understanding. And so it seems unlikely to me that in a discourse that we know historically is shaped a lot by social media, that this opinion would get a whole lot of traction. Now, they could say that, like, there is a really strong proponent of people that want to be able to excuse themselves from doing anything. And that they would really feel compelled towards this concept of any action as being some kind of action or praxis. And I think it's best to like get ahead of that and just really say simply, if they're defined by not wanting to do anything, probably they already have ways to reconcile that, like to reconcile that dissonance. Um, and they're probably going to be like broadly ambivalent regardless. And even if they do interact with the discourse, once they've excused themselves from that action, to break the cognitive dissonance, it's unclear to me why they would continually interact with it, which would allow for the more active understanding done by the base, probably to take precedence. All of this, I think, can be just weighed empirically. Very few people, I think, honestly, sincerely believe that choice feminism believes sincerely that every single action a woman takes is feminist praxis. So why does all of this matter? I think this really just gives context to even if we just take the two arguments that we just said, I think that we already have probably some degree of offense just by saying, sorry, I'm trying to remember the first piece of framing. So if the observation is just that there's a tendency towards scrutiny, and the framing is that this is likely to be implemented well, then I think that there's already offense in like cutting back that tendency towards scrutiny just because I think that you'll be probably more palatable publicly. Secondly, I think that a lot of times that scrutiny is really, really particularly not useful. And so when we understand that there's a little bit more of a separation between the personal and the political, I think that there's a lot less likely to be things like burnout among your base because you're not infinitely responsible for fixing the problems of feminism. Thirdly, I think that this understanding of the personal as the political particularly lends itself to burnout because then if I am a member of the base and I do everything I can in my personal life and I still don't see change because feminism does emerge in response to patriarchy, a like institution of oppression, then I've sacrificed a lot and gained nothing and have no way to break that tie, which probably just leads itself to quite a bit of base exhaustion. Then I think at the end, if you're feeling ambitious, you can just do a little bit of pretty typical framing about why the base is the most important group that you care about as the feminist movement. You probably have a constitutive obligation to them. They probably they shape the way that you engage with the median person more than any one policy. Because if your base is energized and engaged and has if your base is energized and engaged, they can push for every other policy and think about how to do it well, so on and so forth, etc. And so it probably does outweigh on magnitude. And it's also exponential, right? Like the passion of other people and other people advocating about a cause that they're important for makes other people want to join as well. It creates a space, it just creates a better space, which leads to essentially a snowballing effect. And so yeah, that's a kind of that's an example of like a pretty decent first argument that should cut, if used well, the teeth out of a lot of gov approaches. But the most important takeaway from this is really just to like make sure you're thinking about all the levels of the debate, how it interacts in different spheres and with different systems of power. Make sure you're being meticulous about what the actual delta of the round is. Um, and most importantly, have fun with it. Read stuff that you're interested in. Run arguments that you like and are interested in and think are like cool and true and compelling. And debate becomes a billion% more fun. If you have any questions or want to talk through the motion a little bit more or a similar motion, feel free to shoot me an email. Best of luck this weekend. Yeah, best of luck this weekend.